Well, we'll get started. Thanks, everybody. I'm Dave Summers, Executive Director of the Omaha Bar Association. You are at a Just the Basics CLE that the Young Lawyers Division of the Omaha Bar Association puts on. We're doing real estate development today with Michael and Neeraj. I have worked in Neeraj's Modus co-working space down the street for a couple years now. It's a great space. We've actually done a videocast on that space. So if you guys are looking for more info on a project that he's done, check that out.
Hi. As Dave mentioned, my name is Neeraj Agarwal. I'll be kicking off today. We can just start with introductions.
Sure.
So a little background. I'm a lawyer. I say a lawyer turned developer now. So from Omaha, went to Georgetown for undergrad, Wisconsin for law school. Came back, was in-house counsel with a local development company, White Lotus, a family-owned company that actually a relative of mine runs. Was there for 3 years, got into tax credit financing, HUD financing, really the more complicated the better. That's kind of what I say, brain damage is what I love. So really got into that world, and over the last 10 years, my partners at Clarity, Mike Peter and Tom McClay, we've been working to primarily develop projects in Nebraska doing market rate and tax credit financing. So we'll be talking about some of the projects we've done and some with incentives as well.
And I'm Michael Sands. I'm a partner here at Baird Holmes, so welcome here. Happy to have you. Neeraj and I were joking before this that we're maybe not the best to give a basics presentation because, like you said, kind of the more complex, the better. But I think hopefully this will be helpful to just show kind of generally how these projects are kind of financed and capitalized, and hope that we're able to provide some good info to you.
So what I'm going to do is start off with really just a case study on a project. I think kind of big picture everybody knows with interest rates and construction costs, still inflation, still a problem. Getting any type of real estate development done is difficult. So you've had the creative recently. I know partners who are in the development community who are just not really doing much at all, and some that are just getting very creative. It's, you're getting subordinate debt financing, pref equity, different sources to make these projects work. So really what we're going to start off with is...
Must be an opposite order, then I apologize.
Oh, no, you're fine. Let me see if I go back. Let's see if I skip to mine real quick. Oh, there we go. So this is my slide. Really what I'll start off with is called the Badge Row Building. So this is a project I developed in Sioux City, Iowa. It's a 12-story historic tax credit project. So just a little background on this building. It's been the tallest building in the city for many years. The building behind it you can see is Ho Chunk Casino's headquarters, and they of course had to build it 10 feet higher. So now they're officially the tallest building in the city. But it's a unique story. This building was, darling of the city, really just made the skyline. Developer from California acquired it in 2006 or 7, was trying to develop it into office space and data center space. I think back when data center was really big then. It didn't quite work out. He went bankrupt, not before he spent about $5 million on the property, fixing it up, getting elevators and fixed, as well as doing some abatement work and drywall work. Fast forward, the city, the bank on it foreclosed in, I believe, 2019. The city bought it from the bank in 2020, and they put it out for RFP. And I was one of the applicants for that, basically put together our vision for the project. This, to me, is a very standard kind of mixed-use project. We did floors 3 through 11 were apartments, mall market rate. The top floor, you'll see a picture on the top right, is a lounge for the residents to use. And then first, second, and 12th floors will have commercial space. So a true mixed-use project. What I wanted to discuss is really, this project kind of shows you kind of the complexity involved and kind of how creative you might have to get sometimes. So this is just a snapshot of really what we call the organizational structure for this project. Really, the reason I highlight this is showing that how creative we have to get to make this project work. From a high level, you'll see, and it's really in detail here, so we can send you kind of the snapshots of this after. This project was a historic tax credit deal. So it's a $25 million project roughly. There was about $10 million of that financing was historic tax credit financing. So whereas the federal around 4 to 5 million received, and the state side we got about 5 million as well. On top of that, we received state credits for Great Field, which is for vacant buildings and for parking lots. Basically, just incentivizing development of vacant or underutilized structures. Another state credit we got was a workforce housing credit. That was like the Great Field credit, $1 million credit that we monetized. We sold to third parties and netted about 1.8 million. Going back to the historic credits real quick, I mean, we sell those typically between 80 to 95 cents on the dollar, and those are really a negotiated deal with the investors. Typically, there'll be banks or large insurance companies that will buy them. On this one, we also got clever by including opportunity zone investment money. So you might have heard of that legislation passed a couple of years ago. And basically, it allows people to take, capital gains from usually stock investments and put them into real estate investments in certain areas that qualify for opportunity zones. And basically, the nice thing about it is you get to defer the tax liability on those stock gains for potentially up to 10 years or longer. So that was just another layer we added here. And then ultimately, we had what was called a traditional mortgage. That was about $8.5 million from a bank in Iowa, Lincoln Savings Bank. We also had tax increment financing. So you'll kind of see this capital structure here. This kind of breaks it down. You'll see it's roughly 25 million, and kind of as you see it, there's quite a bit we're stacking here. So kind of working kind of down to ups. There's probably $3.5–4 million of developer profit for me. Usually half of that's invested, so that's kind of standard here. Like I mentioned, the Great Field and workforce credits, we got 2 million of that gross. We sold it for 92 cents on the dollar. We netted 1.84 million. The OZ equity is opportunity zone money I mentioned just right now. That 525,000 coupled with our 1.475 million was our total basically owner equity investment of about 2 million. And then here the SHTC, that's the state historic tax credit equity. This is what we netted. Again, we sold this tax credits for the state historic side for about $96 on the cent, which is very high. But really the reason we sold it for such a high price was because it's what's called a certificated credit, where you just get a certificate and you can transfer it very easily. And because of that, it's a much easier transferable credit and there's a higher price to it. Where if it's a non-certificated, it's just a lower price overall. On top of that, we had a federal historic tax credit, like I mentioned. So we got 3.6 million from that. And then city financing of 2.7 million. So it's really, you see from here, just a snapshot of this project kind of gives you an idea of, to make this project work, which I think many had tried for probably 15, 20 years, we were able to put together in about 14 months by just getting creative and just stacking sources on top of sources just to make it work. And overall, I mean, our equity, while we only put in 2 million, it was less than 10% of the project cost. Candidly, we were initially investing or thinking of investing only $1 million. We had to double our investment just because inflation and construction costs went high. So really, I just kind of present this project to a lot of people as kind of the example of a project where you have to get creative, because a project like this would not work in every state. Like if this was, for example, in Nebraska, this would not be feasible for a few reasons. One reason is in Nebraska, we don't have things like a Great Field credit or workforce credit. So right there, we've just lost $1.8 million. Additionally, in Nebraska, we have a cap on the state historic credits. So because of that, we are only limited, even if your project's a $50 million project, you're limited to $1 million per project based on just legislative restrictions. Here in Iowa, there's no restriction whatsoever. So you could get upwards of $6, $7, $8 million. So this project, I really just highlight to show that now, I think more than ever, developers have to get really creative in order to make these deals work. And your traditional getting a loan, putting in equity, getting some kind of tax abatement and TIF is just not going to work. And I think a lot of developers are learning that right now. And that's where the creativity really pays off. But I mean, a lot of this was uncertain. Like the Great Field and workforce credits, for example, were very competitive ones that we were fortunate to get because we had a lot of local support from the city. And the same on the state historic side, that was a very competitive credit to get. But that was just something we want to start off with to really show you kind of the creativity that's required nowadays. Opportunity zone money, TIF money, state historics, state tax credits. I mean, this just shows you kind of the level of, I guess, really creativity, but also the level of effort that's sometimes required to basically make a project that probably wouldn't be developed for another 20, 30 years into something that's now fully leased, 100% on the apartment side. We're working with a law firm to have them placed on the 12th floor, and then we're working with local kind of breweries and offices to have them placed on the first and second floor. So the goal would be on this project to ultimately kind of close it out, is to lease it out fully by probably end of next year, and then we'll eventually go refinance it with a HUD loan. So long-term, the debt on this property would be non-recourse and at better terms. But I really just wanted to start this and really highlight, I think more practically speaking, more than anything, that today we face a lot of challenges from the development side, and lawyers and developers and accountants as well have to work together to get very creative, or projects like this won't ever happen, or you're going to have to wait a couple years for them to become a reality. But with that, I'll turn it over to Michael briefly, and then I'll jump back on.
So I'll focus in on one of those incentives, that being tax increment financing. Yes. So when I give these presentations, I like to start with this slide because I think it's a good visual representation of what TIF is. So most people have heard of TIF. And as Neeraj said, Nebraska is really kind of behind the curve when it comes to incentives and the incentives that they offer. We're really not all that competitive with like your Iowas or Kansases or South Dakotas and Missouris. They offer a lot more options than Nebraska does. So TIF is widely used everywhere, but it is absolutely the main incentive available for developers in Nebraska, and the most widely used. So for that reason, most people have heard of it. A lot of the projects around Omaha within what's called blighted and substandard areas, which that is really up to the city to decide. In Omaha, it's really just South O, downtown, North O, and then a little bit out towards 72nd. West of 72nd, there's little pockets here and there, but not many. It's really all east of 72nd towards the river. So what is tax increment financing? So on this graph, and I can't take credit for it, it's actually the city of Omaha's that they use on their website that I pulled from there. I like to think, though, about that bottom green line as a vacant tract. So, think of it, you have this vacant tract at the beginning of that access, and because there's no improvements on it, or it's underutilized, it's not generating very much property taxes. The assessed valuation is low. It's a vacant tract. So, there it says $1,000. I don't know, let's call it, $100,000. So you have $100,000 tax assessed tract, and a developer comes in and says, you know what, I want to build something on it. I want to build apartments on it. And if it is in that blighted and substandard area, they would presumably have the option to apply for TIF. And what TIF allows for is, once a project, assuming that TIF is approved, once a project is built, naturally that valuation is going to increase. In my example, we're talking about a vacant tract, so you only have land value. Once you build improvements on it, it's going to go up considerably as far as what that's assessed at. And so what TIF allows developers to do is capture that increase that's caused by those improvements that they build for a period of up to 15, can be 20 years due to recent constitutional and legislative changes, but 99% of the time it's going to be a 15-year TIF. So where does that money go? So it's used to pay back the developers for certain TIF eligible project costs. TIF is very much a local incentive. Individual municipalities have a lot of discretion and control over how they administer TIF. So what is TIF eligible can vary a little bit from community to community. Yeah.
Is it sort of like a loan in some sense?
It is not. It's much more like a reimbursement of their property taxes. So if you think about it, So that green line, that would be what the property taxes were being paid on that vacant tract. So once they build something on there and that the valuation goes up and thus the property taxes go up, this green line, whatever it was before the project, that always goes back to the taxing jurisdictions or entities. They're never out, they're not getting less money than they were before when there was nothing there, when it was just the land value. But any increase over that, the developer still pays their property taxes as they always would. They pay them to the county. However, what the county does is they divide them. They divide out this green area, that base value. They send it to the taxing jurisdictions. Anything over that, they send back to the city, which the city then sends to the developer or their lender if they've monetized that TIF. So it allows for that for a period of 15 years. But so it, TIF is based off of, or the amount of TIF a developer can receive is really based on two things. It's based on how many eligible costs they have. And bear in mind, this is all decided and put forth at the front end. So it's a lot of educated guessing based on whatever bids they may have or kind of educated guesses on costs. And then also an educated guess on what is that valuation going to be after we build this project. You don't know that at the front end. The county won't tell you that. They specifically won't tell you that because they don't want to be held to, you said that it was going to be $1 million and it was only $800,000 and now there's a shortfall with my lender and everything's going wrong. So the county will never give you any idea of what that'll be. But that is the procedure for underwriting the amount of TIF that's approved. So
Yep.
Does the developer get the full amount up front, or does the money come in as the taxes are collected?
yeah, so they don't get, what they get from the city is a note. They get a promissory note. And so most of the time, developers will need to actually monetize that as part of the construction financing, the upfront financing of the project. So what they'll do is they'll turn around and they'll monetize that note to a bank. So they'll get a private loan from a bank. They'll put the promissory note that they received from the city up as collateral, and they'll usually have to sign like a personal guarantee on top of that. Because usually there's going to be the construction lender. Construction loan is different. They'll have the first lien mortgage on the property and the projects and the revenues from that. So usually with the TIF loan, it's going to be smaller than the construction loan. So that bank will take the promissory note for that revenue stream. And then if there are any shortfalls, if we've overestimated what that value is going to be and it doesn't yield as much TIF, then the developer has to pay that out of pocket. Yep. So that is just kind of the very basic rundown of kind of what TIF is and how it works. And obviously the benefit of it and one of the very basic tenets of TIF that you have to establish is that there's some gap in the financing. And it's not a hard burden to meet these days for the reasons that Neeraj outlined, because of how high rates are, how high construction costs are. So that's a very easy thing to argue, now, here and now. A few years ago, when interest rates were, 2%, it could be a little more difficult to argue that there's some gap or there is a need for the TIF. In fact, the Nebraska statutes require a finding that the project would not occur and could not occur but for the TIF. So at its very basic level, that's what it is. And then of course, after that 15-year period, or once the TIF note from the city is paid in full, then all of that increased tax revenues goes to the taxing jurisdictions. So, and based on what I just said, that if one of the very basic tenets of TIF is, but for the TIF, the project wouldn't occur, then that should be looked at as a windfall for the taxing jurisdictions. Although they are deferring it for 15 years, by its definition, at this point, if you didn't receive TIF, then we might just have that baseline value going on in perpetuity.
How long ago did this come into effect? Do you know?
The 70s. Yep, late 70s. So it's been in use a long time. It originally was used and still continues to be in a lot of senses or in a lot of places as a purely city financing mechanism. The city would actually, build out the infrastructure itself by forming improvement districts, bonding it, and then doing the infrastructure itself, but paying itself back. And then the developer, hoping that would attract developers. It is very much morphed into, in most cases, the developers doing all of the development, including the public infrastructure development. So I think with that, I will hand it back off to Neeraj to go into a couple other items on this.
And there's one thing I wanted to add in, kind of what Mike and I talked about is kind of going back to the creativity discussion is we have TIF, but also we have another concept. That's energy efficiency program called PACE. So PACE stands for Property Assessed Clean Energy. And really why I bring this up is as a developer, it was standard, as Michael said, is one of your things when you are putting together your capital stack for your project is seeing beyond your traditional loan and owner equity, what else can you put in? TIF was kind of a go-to. It would equate for 10 to 15% of a project cost. So what has happened really over the last couple of years, I think PACE passed within the last 5 to 6 years in Omaha, Nebraska specifically, is that it's a mechanism that's often combined with TIF. And now we're seeing kind of developers not go down the TIF route and instead use a PACE loan. So I'll kind of go into PACE a little bit so you understand kind of how they work together. But basically PACE, or Property Assessed Clean Energy, was a program that was designed for owners of commercial properties, whether it's a hotel, office, or multifamily project, to lower their operating cost by improving energy efficiency and water consumption. That was the fundamental goal. The policy goal is to really promote energy conservation and on the private sector really reduce the amount of energy costs for private property owners. What really similar to, I guess, TIF, really what the developer does is get a loan for the PACE, and they basically utilize that loan to build energy efficient components in the project. So it could be HVAC, it could be lighting, it could be relating to their windows, various ways to just reduce the long-term operating costs of a project and really use that loan to finance those specific build-outs of a project. These PACE programs, they can only be used for really specific types of assets. It's really commercial property, so like I mentioned, hotel, multifamily, office is traditional, or industrial, but you can't use it for residential. It can be used for new construction, but also renovations as well. But going to really the key thing here that kind of piggybacking on the TIF discussion is what you see now is a model of developers getting more creative by combining TIF and PACE. So when I say combining TIF and PACE, what I say and mean is that a developer will typically go and get TIF approval. So they get that reimbursement from their taxes, say twice a year. But they don't get a TIF loan. They actually, what we call it is, say, hold the TIF, or they don't monetize it. So say, for example, my TIF reimbursement is $200,000 payments come back to me a year. Instead of getting a TIF loan, I now get a PACE loan. And really the rationale for it is relatively simple. Like Michael mentioned, while you can do a 20-year TIF now, typically 15 years was the standard. PACE, on the other hand, you can get a 25-year term or 27-year term in amortization. So your loan period is much longer, and it allows you to basically maximize your dollars. So I've done this even on the co-working space Dave had mentioned early on Modus, which is at 19th and Howard. We had gotten a TIF loan approved for $1.5 million. We got PACE of $2.1 million. We just picked up $600,000 by combining them and by just making the building a bit more cost efficient, energy efficient. And this is something you see all the time. So my partners actually did, Tom and Mike with Clarity. They had partnered with Matt Dwyer Green and Jay Lund. We had developed most of the Blackstone district with them. And they had done the Cottonwood Hotel, which many of you might have seen. And that was a very large TIF and PACE kind of combination. And I think their PACE loan was in the realm of, I think, $5 to $10 million. So you'll see this kind of combination being utilized more often just to maximize those loan dollars. But the issue is it really only works well when you compare TIF with PACE. Because one issue with PACE that a lot of, I guess, developers find out when they try to do PACE alone is where you're doing PACE, you need to have a special assessment for the PACE lender to be paid back from the property. That's typically an issue with any traditional lender because they don't like any special assessments or liens. They just want their lien kind of primarily there and nothing else there. But when we combine TIF and PACE, that's not an issue. But I just highlight that you don't often see PACE utilized, at least in Omaha or other places, without that combination, just because it's a lending issue. But ultimately, it's one of those things that I think going forward, you'll see a lot more, I guess, developers not doing TIF anymore if they can combine PACE as well. Because essentially, you're just leaving money on the table. If I can get $3 million in TIF, why wouldn't I go get $4 million in PACE? So that's something that I think you'll probably see a lot more occurring in the future. But I think just one caveat going back to the interest rate discussion kind of started off with is PACE is a very different structure. So I think TIF loan will be like a spread of maybe 2% over the 10 years. So today it'd be 6.5%. PACE lenders we're seeing, and there's nobody in Omaha we work with, they're all kind of national players coming to the Midwest. Their index or their spread of the interest rate is typically, I think, 4.5% over the 10 years. So today that would be around 9%. So it might not make sense in all cases. But really just highlighting, I mean, with TIF and PACE is just another example of developers and their attorneys and their team getting creative to make these financing projects work.
And sorry if it seems a little all over the place, but that is kind of the nature of our work too. So it's a good representation of that. So I just want to, I'll go through a few of the projects that I've worked on here in Omaha that you might recognize, and maybe some other around the state. So about much of what I do, in Omaha, 100% of what I do in Omaha and Lincoln is developer work. I represent developers. Outside of Lincoln and Omaha, I represent about 20 to 25 municipalities across the state. Because in those, Lincoln and Omaha have their own internal attorneys that know TIF very well, and so they do that in-house. Outside of Lincoln and Omaha, their typical city attorneys do not have the expertise or do not specialize in this area, so they will hire someone like me and really only a couple others within the state that do that, to come in and advise and kind of run the incentive side of things for those cities. But with respect to Omaha, just a few that have used capital stacks, very similar to what Neeraj was talking about. One being the Farnham. I'm not sure if any of you, I'm sure some of you had been in that building before this development, but it's really kind of, they did a beautiful job. I'll say that. And it took a lot of incentives to do that. It took Opportunity Zone. They did PACE. They did TIF, of course. Probably leaving a couple out there, but and that's the inside of the Farnham. If you haven't been there, go there, because it really is beautiful space. Yep, very good restaurant, great outdoor little bar area. So just what I would perceive as a success story. And then another one within the last couple of years was the Benson Theater. And I love when these kinds come to me, because they are the easiest to pass through the city, because you'd have to be nuts, to oppose that. So it's kind of just streamlined. But they did a beautiful job on the Benson Theater. And if you haven't stopped by there since they reopened, I'd highly recommend it. And they, in addition to TIF, they did historic tax credits. So that was part of that capital stack, and they did a beautiful job of that. But as far as that, so doing both kind of developer side within Lincoln and Omaha and city side outside there, it's an interesting dichotomy. And I say that because, as I said earlier, cities have a lot of latitude on how they run their TIF programs. So Omaha is by far the most arduous to get anything passed in TIF. And that makes sense, right? Because Omaha produces more than half of the state's GDP. There's a lot of companies and developers that want to be here. So they really have no lack of choices. They are kind of the gatekeeper, right? And if you want in, you have to do it by our rules. And they have a ton of leverage for that. And for that reason, there's a lot of quid pro quo when it comes to TIF or incentives in Omaha. You'll come in with a project and you'll say, I want to build this, and they'll say that looks great, but you also want to build sidewalks and new gutters and all of these public improvements that, of course, increase the cost, but then it's kind of at that point a negotiation with the city of, yeah, we can do this, but we can't do that. It's cost prohibitive. So it's all kind of a balancing act. But it's all because the city has a ton of leverage. Whereas outstate, instead of here's an incentive that we hold, come bow to us, it's more purely economic development. Like, we will give you TIF if you build here. Just come here, build here, please. We'll streamline the process. It'll be, in and out in a month and a half. Whereas it's very different in Omaha for good reason. So it's just kind of an interesting dichotomy for that. And then I was just going to go over, so with respect to kind of those outstate projects that I work on where I represent the cities, they're obviously can be of a lot different nature, but that doesn't mean that they are smaller projects. So this is one that we did in the last year. AGP, which is their world headquarters is over on Dodge here. They're a huge international company. They own ports on both coasts and ship grain and ethanol everywhere. They built or in the process of building a $700 million facility in David City. And that took a public-private partnership. So that was more what I was talking about before, where the city is coming in and has to build a lot of infrastructure. And so the city shared in the TIF, but they also had to do that to attract AGP. They could have had a lot of suitors as to towns that they could have built at. They're going to create a lot of jobs. They're going to bring in a ton of tax revenue. So that's a scenario where it was very much the city saying, please come here. We will, roll out the red carpet, so to speak. And that's not to say that Omaha never does that. Obviously, a project like Mutual of Omaha, the tower, they're going to swing as big a sword as the city does. But, few projects can actually carry that kind of weight in Omaha. And the other one I'll just go over briefly, which occupies a lot of my time these days, especially outstate. Maybe not. Maybe I didn't get in there. I'll just talk about it. So workforce housing. So I don't think it's any secret that that's a huge issue across the entire United States. It's a very big issue in rural communities. It's hard to get builders to come there. It's extremely expensive to build, and the incomes aren't as high as they are in Lincoln or Omaha. So municipalities are getting extremely creative and doing kind of like what I was talking before, where they kind of build it and they will come. They will build out these subdivisions, and they will use TIF and some other resources like LB 874 funds, workforce housing funds, any sort of funds that they can get their hands on to build these residential subdivisions, with the hopes that developers will come in, because a huge part of developing subdivisions is the infrastructure. So if they have to just come in, build a house and can mark it up and sell it, there's a lot less risk, a lot more chance for a profit margin. But it just shows you the kind of risk that cities are willing to take on right now, just to build housing. I think it's admirable, but as a trained lawyer, it makes me nervous, those sorts of things. But they are willing to take that risk so that their cities don't die and continue to grow, and that they have housing. And
can that be market rate, or does it be low income, or do you get more credits if it's low income compared to market rate?
Yeah, so very little LIHTC going on outside of Lincoln, outside of urban areas, really. So it is usually market rate. But a couple of years ago, the legislature introduced an offset of TIF called workforce housing TIF, which is available for these projects. And what that means is that normally, as I went over earlier, TIF can only be used for certain eligible costs, kind of public improvement sort of costs. With workforce housing TIF, which means if you keep the cost of those homes under a certain level, right now it's $275,000. We're petitioning the Department of or the DD to raise that to like $300,000 or $325,000. But irregardless, so long as you keep it within that range, you can get eligible, you can get TIF on any cost, really. So typically you can't get, you can get, TIF back on those, public improvements, site work, things like that. But when you're talking about foundation up of the new improvements, not eligible. Workforce housing, it is eligible. But it's also a hard one to use because oftentimes those infrastructure to true public costs or what would otherwise be deemed TIF eligible costs, those already eat up all of your TIF. So they're trying to find unique ways to use it, and hopefully it ends up being successful. But just wanted to highlight that a little bit, and not sure if Neeraj has anything more, or otherwise we can chat and take questions.
All right, well, I'll just toss one out, and very elementary, but my husband and I own some land in Blair, so we thought, well, we'll build 12-plex on it. We go down to the housing department, talk to them, city planners. They have not had any new apartments in over 20 years. They have a shortage of housing, and they're not willing to bend at all. We have no TIP, we have no incentive, and we do nothing. Everybody wants to have affordable housing, workforce housing. Blair's a pocket community. So I don't understand. You sound like, 20 municipalities have money. But I'm a lawyer, but I'm not in this business, but I just got nowhere with the planning department. What about the mayor? No, just talk to the planning. It's just like this mom and pop thing where they have a little tiny office in the courthouse. How do you get TIF, and that's Blair. If you go out to these little towns, is TIF money just floating around? People can just grab it and develop something?
So I better be careful because I represent the city of Blair, and they did not bring your project to me, so I can honestly say that.
You agree they haven't had anything in 20 years, and they claim they don't have any housing.
So just in general, yeah, I mean, yes, that is not unique to Blair. It is very common for cities to say, you know what, we really, really need this housing, yet they're not willing to get creative or utilize their incentives for it. With housing and TIF can be a difficult pairing. I'm not sure if this is why that's the case there in Blair. That's because, when you're dividing taxes and utilizing TIF, you are taking away, for housing, what you're doing is you're potentially introducing new school-age children, yet you are not introducing any additional tax revenues to pay for those kids or to expand the schools. And so many cities, especially outside of Lincoln and Omaha, who get state aid for education through TIOSA and all of those things, they hate using TIF for housing, and especially multifamily housing, just for that reason. And if it's not the city or the city staff that thinks that, it's the school district that'll come in and raise hell and make things difficult. And that's the case in a lot of communities.
Unfortunately. To my bigger question, is this a discretionary thing that every municipality has?
Mm-hmm.
So, like the David City, those folks got on the ball, they got interested. Somebody there took the leadership and decided to court a potential builder. But unless it's a big project, I just get the impression that it's very discretionary.
It is.
And if they don't have any leadership or, vision, maybe, it just doesn't sound like it's going to happen. And I don't care one way or another. I just kind of wrote them off like these guys, they lament they don't have any housing, but they're not willing to do anything for anybody.
So how long ago was this?
2 years ago.
So they just got a new city administrator that is very forward thinking by the name of Phil Green. He used to be a Papillion, and before that he was actually the assistant at Blair. Might want to try reaching back out.
All right. Yeah, I mean, I just put that out there because it sounds like you can get creative,
Yeah.
but if you're dealing with kind of I hate to say rural Nebraska community, because we came from those and we live in those and we have family that live in them. But, they're all lamenting how their communities are dying. All they have is a hospital and no place for anybody to work and wham, 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 but they won't do anything about it.
Yep. Yeah, it's unfortunate.
And so city administrators get the okay from city council or mayor or whomever has that ability to.
Yeah, ultimately it's always going to be it's ultimately always going to be the council, but oftentimes it is the city administrator who kind of pulls the strings.
And is that kind of done on a year-to-year basis that they determine how much they're willing to set aside for that?
No, it's really just how progressive and aggressive cities want to be. A lot of my municipal clients, will do maybe one a year because that's just kind of what they've always done. And others will do as many as they possibly can do because they see it as growth. So,
Yeah, I mean, just adding to that, I think, like, you kind of hit the nail on the head. It is very much discretionary. Like, my experience in Omaha is until we had just new leadership at the planning department with Dave Fanslaw, and they've become a lot more developer friendly. We had projects that were waiting for 2-3 years because we were arguing over parking ratios. And just minor stuff like that gets in the way. And Sioux City is a good example. They were very forward thinking. They want to get this building done, and they bent over backwards to make TIF and everything else happen. So I think it really comes down to leadership level, and really, as a mayor, the city council really wanted to drive economic development. So yeah, like Michael mentioned, I think just a change in leadership can make all the difference. But we've learned, it's really much who are the players at the table and what is their vision for the city. But it's also, you'll see all the time articles that really tear down TIF and a lot of people against it. So I think it's just a political issue too, and it varies city by city. So if you get a lot of pushback in an election, they might say, we're going to do limited TIF, we're not doing it for housing. So I think it just varies very much by city.
Yeah. To that point, when clerks will ask me kind of what I do, they see I go speak to city councils and stuff. They're like, oh, so it's kind of like litigation light. So kind of, it's more like politician light.
Yeah.
There's a lot of politicking that you have to do. That's just how it goes.
Are there any examples that you guys know of that are local that have been disasters that haven't worked out? I can't think of any, but maybe I'm.
Crossroads has been going on a long time.
Yeah. Yeah. Right.
That's a tough nut to crack.
And there's always controversial ones, even like the bigger players. Like I noticed, if you're doing a big project out west, like whether it's Topgolf, stuff like that, they'll look for specialty financing, whether it's like a EEA, like enhanced employment area, which I think you guys used on the Farnham Hotel, and my partner did on the Cottonwood Hotel. But I think if you're trying to do TIF out west, you can get it done, but you're gonna have to go ask nicely to the mayor and the city council to get a bit more flexible. But yeah, I don't recall anything that's been where they had a TIF projection and it was completely off guards or just kind of off what their projections were. But I think with SIDs, which is a different discussion altogether, I think that's where you see a lot of the issues, where you have these projections on valuations, they don't pan out, and the SID goes horribly or goes bankrupt 2 years later.
Yeah, there's certainly quite a few in the last few years that just haven't happened because of the market environment.
Yeah.
A few that I've worked on, they just can't. They're still trying to get it to make sense financially. So.
Just your thoughts. It seems like Kearney is booming, Grand Island's kind of fizzing, North Fork seems kind of flat. Are there communities where there's more growth in Nebraska? Are there some that are really going after the development? North Platte, because I work all around the state and I travel out to these different towns, and you can just kind of get a feel. Now, do you think that comes down to who's in charge on city council or who's?
Yeah.
Jason, the
yeah.
business?
So actually, Norfolk is actually extremely progressive. They do tons of TIF. They're in the process of completely redoing their downtown. They do their client. I do probably 10 to 15 projects for them a year. And that's because their mayor is extremely forward thinking about these things. It's all trickle down from the mayor to the city staff. But and like Neeraj said, and Gene and the city staff have gotten a lot better and a lot more development friendly. And I think that ultimately came from the top down from Mayor Stothert. So
yeah, and other cities, I mean, we've seen like Beatrice, they've reached out to our company and others. I think they're had a change in leadership as well. So I think they're a lot more developer friendly. So we've seen like certain smaller cities like that. But yeah, I think Michael's primarily dealt with a lot more small cities than I have.
Yeah, it just depends on what that leadership is, and how angry the the citizens are. Some communities just hate TIF for whatever reason. I think because they don't actually understand it, but they think they're being taxed.
On TIF, are there any studies that show that after the period, the 15 years, that whether or not that property continues to increase their value or whatever, or did cities lose out on some money during that period of time? I think people think that. Like, okay, yeah, the city's not getting the money during the boom time, but then what happens after the 15 years? It needs to be renovated again, blah, blah, blah. And so the property taxes, maybe the valuation goes down. Maybe there wasn't been enough done before recent years to keep track of that. But that's...
Yeah, no, there's certainly reasonable arguments to that effect. I guess my thought on that is that if you're running off of the basis that project may have never happened without these incentives, a percentage of something is better than a percentage of nothing. And that's why really anything at the end of that 15 years should be viewed as a windfall. Now, certainly there are probably certain projects that happen that are, and it's hard now. Most projects do need these incentives because the costs are so high. But in the past, I'm sure you could probably point to some that you could be critical of saying, well, did they, need this or not? And that's not for me to say, but I think that's probably the biggest criticism against it is whether that but-for test is being met.
Okay. Any other questions? I got one more. On the streetcar that just came out, that it was going to be a shorter route, and then UNMC came in right away and said, "Yep, no, we're interested in having the route come all the way through UNMC." Any insight as to, was that a push off to, because then they said UNMC would have to pay for the extension. Was that maybe potentially because costs overruns and then they just shortened it and then they just pushed it to UNMC to actually pay for that? Or was it always going to be that UNMC was going to pay for that? Do we have any insight on that? Because the value would only increase UNMC, it seems like it makes sense that they would be the ones that have to pay for that portion of it. But
yeah, I can't. I don't know if I can speculate where it was. But I'm sure those were some interesting conversations between the city and UNMC. But UNMC is a great partner to the city, so it wouldn't surprise me if they were it wasn't a contentious deal and they were like, yeah, we want this, and we'll just.
Yeah, but that's a good point. I kind of just to weave it back to TIF. I think the streetcar is a good example. I think it's if you're within a certain area of the streetcar along Farnham Street, projects like ours, then you have to give 25% of the TIF you get into that bucket to develop the streetcar. So it just kind of ties into showing that even the city's getting creative when it needs to do something as far as a streetcar. So that was something surprising that it did, but I think and hopefully it should work out in the end. But it's just another example of the creativity involved.
Right. And their reasoning for that is that the streetcar in and of itself will increase what you think that valuation is going to be an extra 25% because it's going to be such a wonderful corridor. Obviously, we'll have to see how it plays out, but that's the logic behind it. Well, thank you.
All right, appreciate